Our next speaker is Rachael Roberts. She is sponsored by Pearson Education. Rachael has been in ELT for over 30 years. She is a teacher, a Celta and Delta trainer. Sorry, Rachael. A Celta and Delta trainer. I thought it was quite impressive. A materials writer, and she's a qualified life and business coach. Rachael is going to talk to us today about the growth mindset and how to nurture it in teenagers to help them take responsibility for their own learning and build their self-confidence. Welcome, Rachael.
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for the introduction. Yes, I just felt about 120, but it's a great business to be in ELT, isn't it? And I'm very happy to be here today. Not quite as happy as I would have been to be there in person, I guess. But seeing as we can't do that, this is absolutely the next best thing. So, as Sarah said, I'm a teacher trainer, materials writer, and life and business coach. I have a lot of hats. I'm also, among other books, one of the authors of the new Pearson Upper Secondary series, High Note. And some of the examples that I'm showing today will be from that book. And as Sarah said, I'm very interested in psychology. I trained as a counsellor and psychotherapist some years ago, and I also have a diploma in coaching. And I think the connections between psychology and teaching are obvious and very fruitful. So in this webinar, I'm going to look at what we understand about motivation and growth mindset can help us to help our students. So to start with then, how many of you have seen a toddler learning to walk? Can you just, if you have, just write in the chat box what happens in that process? What's it like when a toddler is learning to walk? Okay, yes, I'm seeing a lot of falling over, absolutely. Lots of patience, stumbling, uncertainty, trial and error. Yeah, but exactly, willing to try again. Jane says, frustrating if it's yours because you get a sore back. Absolutely. Tenacity. Yeah, so we're seeing those kinds of words. They fall down a lot, right? But they do pick themselves up again and carry on. You know, you might get the odd tantrum, but what you don't find is toddlers saying, oh, well, you know, I'm obviously hopeless at this walking stuff, so I'm just not going to try anymore. But by the time that students become teenagers, we often do kind of have that attitude of, oh, I can't do this, so I'm just not, you know, not going to even try. You know, so they start out full of tenacity, as someone said, and somehow by the time they get to teenagers, they seem to have kind of lost that natural motivation that they had at primary school. And they've decided what they can and can't do, what they're good at, what they're bad at, and they are ever more self-conscious about losing face by making mistakes. In other words, they've developed what we would call a fixed mindset, which will hold them back considerably and limit, you know, their potential. So let's look at what we mean by fixed mindset in a bit more detail. So I'm going to start with a little quiz for you. So just look at these pairs of sentences, and for each one, decide whether your kind of mindset is more A or more B. If you want to put this in the chat box, that's fine. If you don't want to and you want to keep it private, that's also fine. So I'll just give you a few minutes to look through these. So in each case, is it more A or more B that's like you, do you think? Okay, so I'm seeing a few answers. Okay, so if you look at this with the colour in, we can see, right, that the A's are more what we would call a growth mindset, and the B's are more what we would call a fixed mindset. Now, I should say that this is not a sort of black and white either or, either you're fixed or you have growth. It really doesn't work that way. It's a continuum, for one thing, but also we can have a growth mindset when it comes to some aspects of our lives and learning, and a fixed mindset when it comes to other aspects of our lives and learning. But I think these examples start to show you kind of what we mean by fixed and growth mindset. So these are terms which were coined by Carol Dweck. You may have come across this book already. It had a huge influence on the education world when it came out. And basically, she's talking about if you have a fixed mindset, then essentially you kind of believe that your basic abilities, your intelligence, your talents are fixed traits. You have what you're born with, and that's it. Whereas with a growth mindset, students understand that their talents and abilities can be developed through effort, through good teaching, of course, and persistence. So that doesn't mean that everyone is the same. Obviously, we have natural talents, and it doesn't mean that, you know, everyone is potentially Einstein. However, everyone can get smarter and better at things if they work at it. So essentially, if you believe that intelligence is static and that you can't change it, then when you're in the classroom, you're going to have a very different attitude towards learning than if you believe that this is something that you can change. So to look at some examples, when you come up against a challenge, if you have a fixed mindset, you're likely to try and avoid that challenge because you want to avoid looking stupid. You want to avoid revealing that you can't do it. If you have a growth mindset, then you will embrace that challenge as a way to stretch yourself and to learn. Similarly, if you come up against an obstacle, if you have a fixed mindset, then you're likely to just give up when you're faced with a setback because you don't believe ultimately that you can overcome it. If you have a growth mindset, then you're going to persevere when you're faced with setbacks and obstacles, which obviously is what we want for our students. Effort, right? So if you have a fixed mindset, then you don't necessarily want to put in too much effort because you might believe that if you have to try hard, that means that you're not very talented or clever or good at the subject. So therefore, you might not try hard because then you can't fail, if you like. If you have a growth mindset, you understand that putting in effort is ultimately what leads to success. There's plenty of evidence to show that with enough practice, everybody can get at least reasonably good at most things. Feedback. Now, as teachers, a huge part of our job is giving feedback, and how receptive our students are to that feedback will make a lot of difference to how well they do. But if you have more of a fixed mindset, then you're quite likely to ignore any negative feedback, even if that feedback is constructive, because, you know, it's embarrassing, it makes you feel stupid. Whereas if you have a growth mindset, then you can see that constructive feedback, whether that's positive or negative, can help you to improve. And so you're much more likely to take that feedback on board. And finally, the success of others. So if you have more of a fixed mindset, when other people succeed, you see that as a threat and it triggers insecurity. It's what's sometimes referred to as comparisonitis. You know, you're constantly comparing yourself with other people and wondering whether you come up short. If you have a growth mindset, then you're more likely to see other people's success as inspiring and even educational, because you can learn from what they've done in order to improve your own performance. So why do students lose that growth mindset? Because as we've seen, we're not born with a fixed mindset. We accept perfectly when we're little that it's a process to learn to speak, to learn to walk. I mean, both incredibly difficult things actually to learn to do that take a long time. But as we've seen, students do tend to lose that growth mindset as they get older. So, to be completely honest, a lot of it is about what they see around them and the messages that they hear. So teachers and parents have a lot of influence, peers as well, of course, as they get older. So, teachers, if you have teachers who shame kids for making mistakes or who tell them that they aren't good at things. I had an art teacher at primary school who basically told me that I couldn't draw. And so I believed her and, gave up art. Parents can be very well-meaning, but they can also reinforce this fixed mindset. This is something that my mother used to say to me a lot, and she meant it to be reassuring. However, that just kind of, I think, encouraged me to see maths as something that I just couldn't do. I ended up failing my maths O-level, the exam that I took at 16. I had to retake it. But actually, years later, when I did an MA, I had to do a statistics module. And in fact, it was absolutely fine, because by that point, I'd managed to stop telling myself that I couldn't do it. So, don't get me wrong. I don't mean that we should be telling children, teenagers, that their work is absolutely marvelous, when it isn't. But we should be focusing on the work and not the child. And we should be being careful not to tell them that they intrinsically can't do something. So how can we help our students to develop growth mindset, or to redevelop it, let's say, because we know that they initially did have it. So yes, I'm seeing somebody here saying exactly why I gave up on maths. Yeah, the number of things probably that all of us have stopped doing because somebody indicated to us that it was somehow something that we couldn't do. And the chances are that that really isn't the case. Maybe we couldn't do it, to Olympic standards, but we could certainly do it. So let's look at some ways in which we can help our students to regain this growth mindset. So first of all, I think we can help them to better understand the process of learning, and understand that progress or success does not necessarily look the way that they expect. People often feel, this is something which you see quite frequently on Facebook and things like that, but I love it because it's absolutely spot on. People often think that success needs to be this sort of path from A to B that's direct. And if that isn't what's happening, then clearly there's a big problem and they can't do something. But actually, success looks much more like the path on the right. There are lots of false starts, there are lots of appearing to go backwards, there are lots of herring off in the wrong direction, but ultimately the trajectory is upwards. And if we understand that, then that helps us, I think, to deal much better with the challenges that we meet along the way. So, ultimately, encouraging a growth mindset is about changing our students' perception and indeed our own perception, because we also may well have picked up messages along the way that encourage us to have more of a fixed mindset, at least about certain things. So the language that we use is the first thing I think that I'd like to focus on. So in her book, Mindset, Carol Dweck talks a lot about the importance of yet. So, when somebody says, I can't do it, the response is, well, you can't do it yet. And it's a very simple difference, but actually the impact is massive, because it's going from a closed, fixed mindset approach to a much more open, this is something that can be achieved approach. And we also need to think carefully about the language that we use when we praise students. So here are 3 pieces of typical teacher praise. So again, in the chat box, what do you think might be the problem with saying these things to students? I'll just give you a couple of minutes. What do you think might be the problem with saying these things? So I'm not, okay, yes, I wasn't seeing anything in chat box for a minute there. Yeah, praising what they are, not what they did. Praise only some, good point. Too enthusiastic, too much. Teach them that they're expected to never fail. Encourages laziness. But yeah, well, certainly you're really clever, Can. No possible improvement. Yeah, so good, very good points coming up here. So what can we say instead? Let me show you some examples of the kinds of things that we could say instead. So instead of saying, you know, you did brilliantly as usual, which is basically, as you know, as somebody said, that could encourage laziness, because it could encourage people to think that they don't have to make any effort. So instead of saying that, you can say that's great, you can give them the praise, and then ask them, okay, how could you increase the challenge next time? Because obviously the work is a bit too easy for them if they're doing brilliantly every time. Instead of saying you're really clever, which is a sort of fixed mindset, and then makes them fear potentially showing you that perhaps they're not that clever if they don't understand something, you can praise them for what they did rather than for what they are, which some of you mentioned. So something like, you've done really well today because you kept going when you hit a problem. So giving them specific things that they've done that have helped them to learn, so that that can reinforce that behaviour. And instead of just saying, oh, that's a great answer, go a bit deeper, you know, so that's a great answer. Can you explain why that's the right answer? So that you're helping them to see that it's not black and white, it's not yes, that's right, no, that's wrong, but that it's much deeper than that, and that it's a process, if you like. So, you know, essentially what we're talking about is, you know, say why something was good, and ask questions, probe, encourage them to go deeper always, so that they can see this as a process rather than producing a product, if you like, of the right answer. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about the teenage brain. So think about the teenage brain, think about it like a house. So, you know, you've got this relatively modest house that you've had since childhood. And around adolescence, you start a major renovation and rewiring project. It's out with the old and in with the new. So the brain is made up of thousands of tiny cells called neurons. And these neurons connect and communicate with each other by transmitting tiny electrical impulses. So think about it like that game, you know, the game where you all hold hands and you squeeze the hands and the squeeze gets sent along the line. We're probably not doing that at the moment, given COVID restrictions, but you understand what I'm saying. So it's very similar. The impulse is sent from neuron to neuron as they connect together. And the more often that this particular path of communication happens, the stronger that pathway gets. So neuroscientists have a saying, what fires together wires together. And so we make these connections in our brain, and each time that we make a similar connection, it becomes stronger. Now, during adolescence, there is, as I said, a massive renovation or rewiring project going on. So the brain is physically getting bigger, obviously, because they're getting bigger generally, but the brain is growing and it's adding lots of new connections. But it isn't just adding new connections, it's also pruning away old connections. So pruning is a gardening term, you know, for when you cut back a plant so that there can be new growth. And this is exactly what's happening in the brain on a really big scale when they're teenagers. And in fact, this process goes on until sort of your mid-20s at least. So in fact, what we think of as adolescence really goes on longer than people thought for quite a long time. And this process starts at the back of the brain, in the more primitive areas of the brain. And it only gets to the which is here, towards the end of the process. Now, the back of the brain is the more primitive part of the brain, and the front of the brain is the more developed part, the part that's associated with logic, with empathy, with making good decisions. And emotional regulation as well. So this is why teenagers are famous for shouting and slamming doors and making poor decisions, because this part of their brain is not yet kind of fully wired up, if you like. But this neural pruning that we've talked about actually does help us to create new and better pathways. So in terms of the pathways, if you think of it, you know, like a pathway through the wood, the more people that walk along that pathway, the clearer the pathway becomes. And the same thing applies to neural pathways. So this is an excellent time actually to learn. In some ways it's not a good time because teenagers have got so many other things going on like hormones, but in terms of the brain it actually is a good time to learn because they're creating all of these neural pathways. And so it is a very good time to develop or redevelop that growth mindset, because the brain is especially receptive to new learning. So let's have a look at some practical ways then that we can help our students to build their growth mindset. Okay, so firstly then, I think we can help our students to develop and to take more responsibility for their learning. As younger children, they don't really have that much say about their learning. You know, they come to class because that's what everybody does. They're told what to do and they do it, or they don't do it. Whereas adolescence is a process of becoming more independent and separating from our caregivers and also our teachers, and starting to take more responsibility ourselves for our lives and for our learning. And you know, teenagers are wired to want this responsibility, but of course they are also in the separating, going through a kind of rebellious phase. So it's about kind of getting them to see that taking more responsibility is in their interests, if you like, is something that they actually want to do. So how can we help them to take more responsibility for their learning? Well, research shows that the more choices you can give them, the more likely they are to take this responsibility, because they want the choices, they want that independence. So a couple of pieces of research here that back this up. Students in a Pittsburgh classroom in the United States were given the chance of deciding which tasks they would work on in the classroom at any given moment. And the result was that the students completed more tasks in less time. So giving them that choice motivated them to do more work. Or another piece of research here, so high school students were given the task of working on a project, but they weren't given clear instructions. They had to decide for themselves how to find a solution. And the result was that the students put more time into the project, they produced better write-ups of the project, and they remembered the material better than those who had been told what to do. So we can see that the more that we can get them to take this responsibility, the better that is, both for their learning and also for them to start that process of becoming independent adults. Okay, I'm just going to see if I can see the checkbox. It keeps disappearing on me, unfortunately. No, I still can't see it at the moment. Oh, hang on. Yes, I can. Okay, lovely. All right, yeah, so I'm just having a quick look at the comments. Okay, so here's an example of something that that you could do in class to help them with this process. This is a lesson from the series that I mentioned at the beginning, High Note, which is a new upper secondary series from Pearson. And one of the key features of High Note is life skills lessons. So these are at the end of every second unit throughout the series. And in this lesson, students are looking at goal setting and how to set smart goals. So the lesson looks at kind of, why goals are important. It looks at some sort of typical scenarios that they might have come across where they perhaps haven't, these students, set goals and what the impact of that has been. And then it talks them through actually kind of like how to set smart goals and how that can be useful for them. So we want our students to start thinking about the process of learning and taking responsibility for the process of learning, rather than it just being something that they do because they've just been coming into school and doing it for years. So one example of this is to help them see how planning can help with the learning process. So research shows that students generally struggle to think of something to say, to get their meaning across, and to be accurate all at the same time. If you think about it, that is quite a juggling act. And we know that planning time can really help with that, because it relieves some of the pressure. So, they've already thought about what they're going to say. They've already given some thought to how they're going to get that meaning across. So that relieves some of that pressure in the moment. And we also know that writing is usually better when we've gone through some planning and drafting. I think we more often apply this, though, to writing than we do to speaking. But we can make this kind of an intrinsic part of what we do with both writing and speaking. So we move away from the idea then that speaking is something that, you're either good at or you're not, because what often happens, I think, is that we get students to do a speaking activity and then we give them feedback on it. And then there is this sense that they either did well or they didn't. Whereas by focusing on planning, we can help them to actually learn how to get better, if you like. In writing, rather than just looking at the finished product, of course we can do planning, we can do drafts, but we can actually ask them to show evidence of their working, like we do in maths. So in maths, we don't just take the answer, we want to see how they arrived at that answer. And it can be the same with writing. So if we get students to actually show us their drafts as well as the finished product, then we're helping them to see that there is a value to those drafts and not just a value to the finished product. So here's another example from High Note, which shows how we can apply that idea of planning to speaking. So the focus here is on telling an anecdote, but we don't just start by getting students to tell stories. We go through quite a careful step-by-step process of planning. So they listen to some anecdotes which are connected to some urban myths. And then they look at some of the phrases that are often used in anecdotes. And we break down the stages of an anecdote, because anecdotes tend to have quite specific and predictable stages. We begin by signaling that the anecdote is about to start, something like, oh, that reminds me of a time when. We then give the background information. Then, as we're giving the main events of the story, there's always a turning point, a reason for, that's what makes it an anecdote. If you don't have that turning point, then it's rather boring. And then we also have points where we show the speaker's attitude to what's happening. I couldn't believe what was happening. Then to top it all. And then we round off the anecdote with what's known as a coda. So we kind of go back to the present and comment on what happened. So we show the students how this works, we look at the language that they can use, and then we give them time to plan the anecdote. So they're not going to be reading it aloud, but they've gone through that whole process before they start speaking, so that they're not trying to juggle all of those things at once, and therefore they're likely to have a more successful outcome. So the second key aspect is related to this, I think, because, you know, if I'm sure you've all got anecdotes that you've told many times, and every time that you tell them, they get a little bit better. And we can use that same principle in the classroom. So as Scott Thornberry says, when learners repeat a task, even a relatively long time after the first performance, gains have been shown in both fluency and linguistic complexity. So I've got a picture of a little girl playing a violin here. Have any of you ever learned to play the violin, or had children who learned to play the violin? What's it like when they first start learning? Maybe it's just me that's experienced this. Yes, painful. Okay, yeah. So absolutely squeaky. Yeah, it's absolutely awful when you first start playing the violin. But with repetition, it gets better. So the key really is to find a way of providing this repetition that is not painful, either for the students or for us. And I think there are lots of ways that we can actually have fun with repetition. So this is one technique which I use a lot. It was created by Paul Nation, and who has written a lot about fluency in speaking as well as vocabulary. And it's called 4-3-2. And the idea is that you put the students into pairs, or it can be in groups, and each student talks about a topic for 4 minutes. So when I say talks about it for 4 minutes, that's not an interaction, that's them talking, and that's timed. You then mix up the groups or the pairs, and they find a new partner or group, and they talk about the same topic, but this time they only have 3 minutes. And then you repeat the process again, and this time they only have 2 minutes. And what happens is that with each repetition, naturally they become more fluent, but the fact that they have less time also encourages them to become more fluent. They need to hesitate less, and they kind of hone down what they're producing, so that by the third time that they do it, it's really slick and much better than the first time. And this enables them to see kind of how repetition and practice can really improve their speaking. It's also very motivating, and it's fun because of the timings and the moving around and so on. And I think there are lots of other things that we can do in terms of repetition to keep it fun and motivating and lively. But absolutely, I think that's a key factor in terms of helping students to improve. So the third point that I would make is related to this. Now, can anybody complete the gap here? This is a quote from now, I won't be able to pronounce this properly, and I've got an Italian audience, so I'm not going to even try. But this guy was the originator of a teaching methodology called the silent way, which might help you. So can anybody complete this quote? Does anybody know what goes in the gap? I've got a couple of suggestions. One of them's right. Okay, so it says blank is a gift to the class. Okay, yeah, so a good teacher is a gift to the class, yes, Rafaela, but that's not the answer. So a blank is a gift to the class. So the answer is a mistake. So a mistake is a gift to the class. And I think this is a really lovely way of looking at it, and actually not just lovely, but spot on. Making mistakes is not a bad thing. You know, we already know that a student with a growth mindset will see a mistake as a positive thing, because it's a learning opportunity. And this is exactly what he means here, that every time a student makes a mistake, that's an opportunity for students to learn and for everybody to learn. And if we want our students to be motivated, then we have to help them to change their beliefs about mistakes. You know, so, you know, going back to the success paths that I showed you earlier, it's not about this direct path, and the mistakes are part of that, you know, process of improving. Exactly. So this lesson here from High Note is all about mistakes and setbacks. And it tells some stories about people who made mistakes and what they learned from making the mistakes. And you can see the vocabulary is also related to this. This is the upper intermediate level. Okay, so we've got things like blunder and masterstroke. And then the discussion here, which I've just blown up a bit bigger next to it, you know, do you agree that a setback can sometimes be a blessing in disguise? Can you think of famous people who messed up but learned from the experience and made a success of their lives? And the quote, anyone who never made a mistake never made anything new. So it is about shifting their perception about mistakes in general. And linguistically as well, we can also help them to see the benefit of making mistakes. One way we can do this is by encouraging them to keep mistake logs. So this is an idea from Mike Gershon, and this works very well, and it really does help students to see things more positively. So rather than mistakes being something that they feel ashamed of and that they try to forget about, we encourage them to actually write down at the end of each lesson some of the mistakes that they made, what they think caused them to make the mistake. So, you know, was it just a slip? Was it something that they didn't understand that now they do understand? And what they learned from the mistake. So it's about seeing it, you know, as a positive thing. Sorry, I've just lost my thread then slightly. Yeah, we can also even go so far as to set quotas for mistakes. So the teacher might say, you know, in every lesson, I expect you to make at least 3 mistakes. Or in this exercise, I expect you to make 3 mistakes. And if you haven't made any mistakes, then that means that the work needs to be more challenging for you. So this is a totally different way of looking at mistakes. And this links to the concept of desirable difficulty. So students can actually learn, and we can learn, to see that something being difficult is a good thing. We know from research by Elizabeth and Robert Bjork that conditions of learning that make performance improve rapidly often actually don't help us to learn, whereas conditions that create challenges help us to learn things long term. So students quite often think that highlighting passages in a book is a good way to revise, but it's not, because the brain, if you're just highlighting it, the brain goes, oh yes, I know this, I know this, I know this, this is easy, and it doesn't retain it. If you test yourself and you make it difficult for yourself, not so difficult that it's demotivating, then you will actually retain that information much better. So this is all part of this idea really of resilience, if you like. And again, this is a life skills lesson from High Note where we focus on resilience. But the point that I really want to make is that resilience is not about being really tough so that nothing ever affects you. Resilience is about how you deal with difficulty. And part of that dealing with difficulty might well be kind of wobbling or, you know, falling over, but it's about the getting back up again. So principles of feedback then for growth. It shouldn't be too supportive, so it's about getting the right balance. Absolutely, praise is important, but baby birds learn to fly when they get pushed out of the nest. So we need to push our students appropriately. We need to challenge them as well as support them. It should involve more work for the students than the teacher. So, how often have you spent 30 minutes or more marking a piece of work only to see the student look at the grade and shove it back in their bag? So find ways for the students to do things with that feedback so that they benefit from it. And related to this, grades and feedback are different things. It's been shown that when there is a grade on a piece of work, students generally take no notice of the feedback because they go straight into that fixed mindset. So either grade or feedback. And when you give them feedback, get them to do something with it. DIRT is an acronym that is used quite a lot in British schools. It stands for Dedicated Independent Reflection Time. And it's about giving students time in class to respond to feedback. So there are various ways that we can do that. Just going to run through a few ideas for you. So target lists. So instead of giving every learner individual feedback on a piece of writing, which takes hours, you can look through the pieces of writing and make a list of, say, 10 targets which apply to many students in the class, and all of them, some of them apply. So we then put the targets on the board and then give the students time to improve their written work in those areas. So by a target, it might be something like paragraphing, it might be something like use of articles. You decide what a lot of them are struggling with. Comparing two pieces of work. So two pieces of their own work, because comparison with others is really helpful, but comparison with ourselves can be very useful. So get them to look back at a piece of work from the beginning of the year and compare it with a more recent piece of work and see what improvements they can notice. Gallery critique. This is a form of peer assessment. Now, peer assessment is great, but it can be problematic if the student's partner is not as able as they are, because they won't be able to give them such good feedback. So for gallery critique, you put up the written work around the room, or if you're doing it on a screen, you can share a screen with different pieces of work on it. And the students give one piece of feedback to each piece of work. It has to be something that's specific, helpful and kind, and which hasn't already been said. So Padlet works extremely well for this, for example. In this way, they have a variety of feedback, and the teacher can also add anything important which hasn't been said. And the last two really are ways of working in class, but they could be adapted to online teaching as well. So margin marking, you've probably used a correction code, but an alternative to that is simply to mark in the margin that there's a problem in that line, or if you're doing it online, excuse me, you can use comments. So rather than giving them what to look for, let them know that there is a problem in that line and they can find it. So to summarize then, because I'm aware that we're coming to the end, some key points about growth mindset to remember. So learning requires, repetition, trial and error, and mistakes, lots of mistakes. That's just part of the process. Difficulty can be something that is desirable. So it's about getting the right level of difficulty, of course, but we shouldn't be looking to avoid difficulty, because difficulty is what signals to the brain that this is something which is worth remembering. Remember, I can't do it yet. Right? So there's always potential to be able to do something in the future. Perhaps you need a different kind of help, perhaps you need a different approach. Praise needs to be specific, not just, oh, you're wonderful, and related to effort, related to what they have done rather than who they are. Autonomy and choice are vital, particularly, I think, for teenagers. And we can give students ownership of the learning process by teaching them about the process of learning so that they can manage their own learning more effectively. Okay, so I think perhaps we just have a couple of minutes for questions. I'm not quite sure with having started late, but I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that come up.
Sure, yes, I think we still have 2 minutes for questions. Thanks for that, Rachel, very interesting. I quite like the comments about learning about the teenagers and how the teenage brain works. Very interesting.
Thank you. I love all that kind of stuff.
Feel free to use the chat box for your questions.
Thank you. CK, so specific, helpful and kind will be my feedback mantra from now on. Yes, that's a good one. I mean, if you have any questions and you want to talk to me afterwards, my website address is on this slide, so please do feel free to contact me through the website. Catherine's asking, when's the book available? It's out now. The series is out already. It's called High Note.
Excellent. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. That was really interesting. I too was really interested in the part about the teenage brain, probably because I have a teenager in the house.
Me too.
I also really liked the idea of the mistake log. I thought that was a great idea, and not just for language learning. All sorts of, any kind of material, any kind of subject that you're working on. Really interesting. Great. So thanks, Rachel. I'll just point out again, Rachel is sponsored by Pearson. All right. Thank you.